So this case is a landmark decision for a number of reasons,
That's Matt Dos
not
Santos.
the least of which is that it protects unequivocally young people's right to a stable climate, which underpins all of their other fundamental rights.
Dos Santos is legal counsel for Our Children's Trust, an Oregon-based nonprofit that represented the 16 young Montanans who sued their state government. The crux of their case was one very specific clause in the state constitution, which guarantees people in Montana a, quote, clean and healthful environment. The plaintiffs, who were between the ages of 5 and 22 at the time of the decision, sued the state over another very specific provision, this time in the Montana Environmental Policy Act.
The state of Montana had statutes on the books that were actively prohibiting agencies from considering the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions or considering the impacts of climate change when evaluating new fossil fuel projects.
Originally filed in 2020, the case became a first of its kind when it went to trial last month. Over the course of 7 days, the court heard emotional testimony from the young people themselves on how climate change was impacting them personally, and from experts who presented scientific evidence of the links between burning fossil fuels, warming temperatures, and extreme weather events like wildfires, drought, and heat waves.
They had psychiatrists and pediatricians testify at the case of the impacts of climate change physically on young people. It's worse because their bodies are still developing. And also the mental health impacts on children was significant in terms of not only climate anxiety, but depression and fear.
That's Lisa Benjamin, an environmental law professor at Lewis and Clark College in Portland. After nearly a week of testimony from the plaintiffs, Benjamin said it was a bit surprising that the state only called 3 witnesses. But she said the defense was facing an uphill battle.
But it really is very difficult to contest the science now on climate change. We can basically see it every day around us, including in Oregon and different states, the devastating impacts that this is having.
Even with the lopsided testimony in court, Benjamin was still taken aback by Judge Kathy Seeley's ruling, which read, in part, the unrefuted testimony established that plaintiffs have been and will continue to be harmed by the state's disregard of greenhouse gas emission pollution and climate change pursuant to the Montana Environmental Policy Act limitation. It's fair to say Dos Santos was quite pleased with the ruling.
It's a landmark ruling that finds that these youth plaintiffs have a constitutional right to a clean and healthful environment, and that right underpins all of their other foundational rights.
And Dos Santos thinks it could have far-reaching implications for other cases.
That's really important, not just for Montana, but really for the rest of the world, as other courts in states and jurisdictions around the world look at this really critical question of, can youth hold their governments accountable for climate change?
Less pleased with the ruling was Montana's Attorney General, Austin Knudsen. Emily Flower, a spokeswoman for his office, called the decision absurd and a publicity stunt. And she said the state would be appealing the ruling, while noting that many similar cases have been dismissed in other cases before even reaching trial. Flower also had some choice words for the plaintiffs' lawyers. Our Children's Trust is a special interest group that is exploiting well-intentioned Montana kids, including a 4-year-old and an 8-year-old, to achieve its goal of shutting down responsible energy development in our state. Dos Santos said it was the passion of the youth that led the lawyers in this case, not the other way around.
Yeah, I think all it takes is to either read something one of our plaintiffs have written or to listen to the testimony that they gave on the stand to understand that these are young people who care deeply about their state and care deeply about their constitutional right to a clean and healthful environment.
Dos Santos also said the ruling could add some momentum to a case more familiar to people here in Oregon. In 2015, 21 young Oregonians filed a climate case against the federal government, alleging constitutional violations similar to those in the Montana case. That case has gone through a bunch of twists and turns over the years, including some instances when it appeared to be all but dead. But Dos Santos said a recent ruling by a federal judge in Oregon put them back on the path toward a trial.
We think that we're likely to be in trial anytime towards the end of this year or early next year.
And Cale's with me now. So what practical impact will this have on Montana?
So the state will now have to consider climate change and the environmental impacts before they issue permits for fossil fuel projects. But that's only if it withstands an appeal. This is almost definitely going to the Montana Supreme Court and could even go above that. So
it just becomes a court battle. Will we see more of these around the country and certainly around the West?
I mean, I think so. When I was talking to Dos Santos, they said that, this really has kind of put the wind in their sails. They really feel like there's momentum here, and they hinted that there will probably be other cases filed along the West Coast, including in Oregon.
Yeah, I can hear somebody saying, if you can win in Montana, you can win anywhere. And I can also hear people sort of dismissing this as all a bunch of hooey, but then they probably said the same thing about the early salmon lawsuits.
Yeah, and where are we now with that?
Yeah, good point. All right, thank you, Cale Williams. Always interesting.
My pleasure.